So we're at 12:32, so I'm going to get started and folks will join us as they're able to. So good afternoon, everyone. Hello, I'm Jocelyn Kennedy. I'm the Executive Director of the Harvard Law School Library. I'm so delighted to welcome you all to the first book talk of this year, of the 21-22 academic year, so welcome. Our talk is being recorded, as you heard when you entered the room, and it will be posted in about a week or two on our YouTube channel. I'd love to take a moment to thank Dean Manning for his generous support of these talks, and a really big thank you to our team, Maya Bergamasco, Rachel Parker, Debbie Ginsberg, and Teresa Knapp for putting together this series. We welcome your questions for our panelists and invite you to use the Q&A feature throughout the talk. We'll reserve some time at the end of our conversation with our panel to engage with your questions. And please visit your local library and your local bookseller in person or online for a copy of today's book, Accessible Technology and the Developing World. It's my pleasure to introduce our co-editors and our discussants today. Dr. Michael Ashley Stein, one of our editors, is the co-founder and executive director of the Harvard Law School Project on Disability and a visiting professor at Harvard Law School since 2005. He's one of the world's leading experts on disability law and policy. He's participated in the drafting of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, works with disabled people's organizations and NGOs around the world, and actively consults with and advises governments, NGOs, and IGOs on their disability laws and policy. Dr. Jonathan Lazar is also one of our editors. He's a professor in the College of Information Studies at the University of Maryland. He frequently serves as an advisor to US government agencies, provides testimony at the federal and state levels, and multiple US federal regulations cite his research. He teaches courses on human-computer interaction, user-centered design, accessibility, and legal research methods. Dr. Lazar is the next director of the Trace Research and Development Center, starting in 6 days. It is the nation's oldest research center on technology and disability. And joining us today as our panelists are Professor Amy Landers of Drexel University's Thomas R. Klein School of Law. She's the director of the Intellectual Property Law Program. Before joining the Klein School of Law faculty in 2014, she was a distinguished professor of law and director of the IP Law concentration at McGeorge School of Law. Prior to joining academia, Professor Landers was a partner at Orrick, Harrington, and Sutcliffe, where she specialized in IP litigation, antitrust, fraud, trade secret, and trademark cases. Deepti Samat Raja is a social development specialist with the Social Sustainability and Inclusion Global Practice of the World Bank. She provides technical assistance and operational support in operationalizing disability inclusion across many sectors and regions. Her areas of focus include digital inclusion, economic empowerment, and inclusive education. Prior to joining the World Bank, she served as Director of International Programs and Senior Researcher at the Burton Blatt Institute at Syracuse University, was a Senior Research Analyst at the Global Initiative for Inclusive ICTs, and was a Research Coordinator for the Global Partnership for Disability and Development. Dr. Raja Krishna is the director of the Information Technology Program in the Department of Science, Technology, and Mathematics at Gallaudet University. His research interests encompass the fields of accessible computing and accessibility intellectual property law, with the goal of improving information access for deaf and hard of hearing individuals. In the accessible computing field, he investigates information access disparities between hearing and deaf communities. And in the accessibility IP law field, he advocates for updates in accessibility and IP law to incorporate accessible computing advances such as automatic captioning and subtitling. And our ASL interpreter today is Patty Lejeune. All of our speakers are also library champions, so for that, we are doubly grateful to have them with us today. And with that, I turn it over to you, Professor Stein, to get us started.
Well, thank you ever so much. It's a joy to be here, virtually or not. And speaking of libraries, my thank you list begins with the Harvard Law School Library, which is the greatest law library in the world, staffed by fantastic people who make my life better and easier every day and enable the scholarship that I and my colleagues do. You're wonderful, and we're grateful to you. On behalf of Professor Lazar, we also would like to thank the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, who sponsored a workshop at which we vetted many of these ideas and worked them through and met with many of the authors. We'd like to thank our editors and publishers over at Oxford University Press. And of course, we would like to thank the wonderful panelists who are here today, but as well, the wonderful authors who are not here with us today, but who contributed from all over the world to this volume. Thank you ever so much. We're grateful to you. Finally, to Jonathan, you're always a pleasure to work with. And we will be sharing the opening today. I'll talk a little bit about what motivated us to put together this book, and Jonathan will talk a little bit about the content of the book. So basically, the story of information and communication technology, ICT, and people with disabilities mirrors that dialogue that's often put forward about development generally, that innovations come from the global north, from the developed part of the globe, down and flow down to the global south, the developing part of the world, that it's done either in beneficence or in goodwill, and that it's a one-way flow. And very little is paid attention to what happens in the developing world. How do countries that are resource constrained come up with their own innovations? What do they do about ICT and other things relating to people with disabilities? So in other words, the typical dialogue is very much a colonial one, one that is imperialistic in flavor. And Jonathan and I, having worked in the area and having had wonderful colleagues from all over the globe, many of whom are featured in this volume, said, well, wait a minute, that's not the whole story. And in fact, the global south, because they cannot afford to waste money on innovations, because they often cannot afford to utilize money on the innovations that come from the global north with hefty price tags, often will go and innovate on their own and come up with schemes that are ingenious, intuitive, inventive, ones that are culturally appropriate, resource appropriate, and able to be used in their own venues. And so what we did with this book was we thought about how we could involve storytelling about what's going on in the larger world, rather than telling it through a global north kind of conduit. Of course, the other thing about ICT and people with disabilities is that we have all been greatly enabled by the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD we'll call it, both its articles on freedom of information and accessibility and international cooperation, and by the Marrakesh Treaty to facilitate access to published works for persons who are blind, visually impaired, or otherwise print disabled, that we'll just refer to as the Marrakesh Treaty. These two international human rights treaties, in addition to the Sustainable Development Goals, are aimed at reducing poverty and inequality, access to ICT, freedom of information and communication, and altogether supported by things like G3 ICT, the UN's global initiative, and other endeavors such as Habitat, which looks at accessible cities and smart cities, are driving change across the globe. We did, however, come up with some conclusions cutting across some of the issues in the book. One is that the technical infrastructures in developing areas are often very different from technical infrastructures in the developed world. That's true. That developing areas may not have existing educational and advocacy infrastructures. That the legal frameworks that exist in developed countries often do not exist or are on their way to existing in the global south. That design methods used for assistive technology and accessible technology are often designed with a global north mindset. Consider, for example, the hit that Apple just took because the powering device for its phones is now going to be synthesized in Europe to one that it doesn't use. Its stock just reduced by 4%. Consider that many of these innovations from the global north are much like other development innovations sponsored by the World Bank and others. They're expensive. They come with certain parts and certain services and certain features, and assume not only infrastructure, that everyone should have the internet, everyone should have a laptop, but also assume that you can afford to buy the parts, replacements, and so on and so forth. Those without experience in development often assume that development only occurs in countries that are of low socioeconomic status. And yet, one of our chapters actually looks at areas of of development and challenges within the global north. Finally, we learned that data needs to be collected about technology accessibility in developing areas, and you'll hear some of that from Deep Dean, and you'll read, if you choose to, the book, some of the chapters on the DARE Index put forward by the UN G3ICT. And we also pointed out that individuals often miss the connection between accessible technology and economic independence. Finally, among the things that came across the book as far as cross-cutting issues is that technology and other innovations are often being pushed by the people themselves. People with disabilities, their allies, innovators, and others, very often social entrepreneurs doing things for the greater good, will come up with innovations and share them, often, for example, piggybacking on patents, which I know Amy will speak about in a bit. So this was a wonderful learning experience. We encourage you to read the book. We hope that you will enjoy today's panel. And Jonathan, now it's over to you.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you again to Harvard Law School Library for this kind invitation. As Michael said, thank you to all of our colleagues and contributors to the book. Very excited to have this book. It will be out in the next month. And we're just very excited by what we're able to put together, right? Because it's actually a very interesting but underrepresented and underdiscussed topic about technology accessibility in developing areas. Typically, when you think about accessibility of digital technology, the stakeholders you think of, right? You think of, okay, accessibility researchers, you think of technology companies, and you think, well, sometimes the legal framework as well. You typically either think of the US federal government, the Canadian national or the provincial governments, you think of the EU, you think of the UK government. When we switch to talking about developing areas and accessibility, it's a completely different set of players, a completely different set of stakeholders, and a different set of constraints and a different set of issues. And so, for instance, when you read about accessibility typically in the US and Northern Europe, you hear, well, okay, bandwidth is not an issue. In developing areas, bandwidth is an issue, right? The infrastructures are just being built now for technology in some of these developing areas. And so there's so many opportunities to kind of jump into the debate, right? And figure out how can we influence, how can we inform these efforts now before an inaccessible infrastructure has been built. In terms of the book, we basically split it into a few different sections. One section is just the foundational chapters about who are the stakeholders, what is the data, what is the playing field. Then we have the legal frameworks, and then we have the applications. So in terms of just the foundational chapters, when we talk about developing areas and we talk about developing countries, right? The World Bank obviously is a major player. And Deepti is going to talk a little bit about the role of the World Bank. The International Human Rights Framework, right? The legal frameworks. NGOs like Benentech, right, which focuses, they're basically the largest distributor in the world of books in fully accessible format. And Michael briefly mentioned G3ICT. And all these things I'm talking about, we have chapters on each one of these. But G3ICT, we actually have 3 different chapters on. So they are an advocacy group, right, founded as part of the UN efforts to monitor and encourage digital accessibility around the world. They have a lot of different efforts, but the one that actually helps drive this topic so much is their DARE Index, right? It is a DARE, Digital Accessibility Rights Evaluation Index, right? And they actually collect data around the world in over 130 countries about progress towards digital accessibility. While it may be measured in a lot of the developed countries, in a lot of these developing areas, there really isn't a good sense. For instance, what are the country commitments? Here are the 3 parts of the DARE Index: the country commitments, the capacity to implement, and the actual outcomes in digital accessibility. Now, if that sounds familiar from how we do other human rights measurement, it actually is. It's based on that. So for instance, one of the fascinating things you'd expect, obviously, that North America and Northern Europe would have relatively high rates of digital accessibility. Would you expect that Central and South America would? Well, actually, it's really fascinating because the four key languages, the four most prominent languages in Latin America, Spanish, Portuguese, French, and English. Because there are countries that are developed countries that use all those languages, some technologies are able to be ported over. And so you see that, for instance, in contrast to East Asia, where there are so many different languages. And so in some cases, things have to be developed locally. Although that can be good because, as Michael mentioned, innovation. Accessibility is innovation. People often miss that. Trying to figure out how to make something more flexible, to make it accessible, that's innovation. Trying to figure out how to do something with fewer resources, that's innovation. So the idea is that in these developing areas, you have all these innovators. You have all these innovators who are trying to figure out, how can we solve a problem? How can we solve a problem with fewer resources? So there's so much to learn from all these different areas. So the first portion of the book, again, deals with foundational chapters, foundational topics, and all the different stakeholders. Another important one is the Web Accessibility Initiative. That's the organization based out of the World Wide Web Consortium that creates technical standards such as the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So if you've ever heard of those, those are the international technical standards that are used all around the world for figuring out how do we design an accessible website. And there are other standards as well for non-web technologies. So that's the first section, foundational chapters. The second section is the legal framework. And Amy Landers is going to talk a little bit about her work on IP law and patents. In the book is also a chapter by Michael Stein and Paul Harper all about the Marrakesh Treaty. And the Marrakesh Treaty is so helpful because it means that if you have a material that you've created in digital accessible format in one country, you can typically transfer it to another country that is also a party to the treaty. And these exceptions that exist in national laws, the Marrakesh Treaty requires these exceptions to copyright law, just like we have in the US, the Chafee Amendment to the Copyright Act. So the second section deals with legal framework. The third section of the book deals with applications. And so when we talk about applications, we're talking about how do we make sure that digital technology is accessible in, for instance, K-12 education. We have a chapter on that. How do we make sure that universities in developing areas support efforts towards digital accessibility? We have a chapter about that. Applications such as ride sharing, and that's a really big impact on people with disabilities in developing areas, but again, only if the ride sharing apps and the whole process is accessible, things like payment. There's accessible mobile banking. And Raja Kushalnagar is going to talk a bit about that as well. So there's so many different things to think about when we think about how do we empower people with disabilities in developing areas. One of the other interesting chapters in the book deals with ludic design, design for fun. And it tells you about how we often have assumptions about accessibility and assumptions about developing areas that we don't even realize. For instance, in this chapter, and there's a chapter coming out of Microsoft Research India, the chapter focuses on play and technology for play. And basically, the chapter describes how, in a lot of developed areas, we say, we're going to build technology for fun. We're going to build it for exploration. We're going to build it to help people explore and learn. And when it comes to developing areas, you often get policies and mandates that say, well, our goal is we just have to figure out, how someone can use this at a functional level rather than an exploratory fun level. Or you see the difference. There's a chapter in a previous book that Michael and I edited all about computer gaming. And computer gaming and accessibility. And is there a human right to computer gaming? And at the beginning of the process, I know Michael was not sure, and we had a great discussion about that. But what happens when computer gaming is used in education? What happens when computer gaming is used for socialization? If we say, well, computer gaming isn't important, then that leads to a situation where people are being excluded. And so that chapter about ludic design is, how do we make sure that we're not only designing just for functional needs, but that we are designing for the whole person, that we are designing for fun, that we are designing to make sure that people with disabilities can explore. And that's really the overall theme of the book. It's about, how do we take our assumptions from the global north, turn them on their head? How do we make sure that people in developing areas are the ones driving the development? How do we make sure that we're using methods that are appropriate? How do we make sure that we're focusing on applications that are appropriate? How do we ensure that we are doing the right thing now when we have an opportunity to make sure that infrastructures are being built, technologies are being built in an accessible way? And how can we make sure that people with disabilities in the global south are empowered? So I want to pass it along then to our panelists, to Deepti, to Amy, and to Raja. And we're going to start with Deepti talking about the role of the World Bank and her fantastic chapter. Deepti, please.
Thank you, Jonathan. And let me start by thanking the Harvard Law School Library for showcasing this book. Thank you, Jonathan and Michael, for embarking on this journey to bringing together analysis and critical thinking on the application of digital technologies for persons with disabilities in the developing world. I am thrilled to have the opportunity to talk about this chapter, co-authored with Charlotte McLean-Naklapo, the World Bank's Global Disability Advisor, on addressing the drivers for digitally enabled disability-inclusive development. Digital technologies are today impacting almost every sector of development: education, health, economic participation, access to finance, public services, citizen engagement. What is exciting about this, and both Michael and Jonathan have alluded to this, is that we know that digital technologies, when accessible, can be catalytic for accessing markets, spaces, and services for persons with disabilities. There are several examples of positive impact and success stories that we present in the chapter. In education, there are examples of accessible digital books and learning content for students with print disabilities, low-cost e-readers, mobile apps to offer sign language instruction. Technology is increasingly pervasive in the world of work, and the growing share of online work in the gig economy opens many doors for income generation. The list goes on. Digital banking, mobile payments, m-health, tele-rehab services, platforms for active civic engagement, disaster response management portals, and so on. There is also a lot of enthusiasm about how new technologies based on machine learning, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, are revolutionizing access for persons with disabilities through smart cities and smart systems. However, the issue is that while there are many examples of success, these are mostly small-scale examples and often stay at pilot stage. When we try to look for large-scale applications of accessible technology in these domains, we are confronted with fragmented services and several gaps in the ecosystem. Over the last year and a half, COVID-19 served as a real-world stress test of how technology fared in ensuring continuity of services for persons with disabilities. And the reflections that we present in our chapter were evident in the insights and stories that emerged. There continues to be a wide gap between the potential of technology and its large-scale application in the daily lives of most persons with disabilities in the developing world. And the digital divide comes in many forms. Now, there are gaps in accessing core infrastructure. So when you look at internet access at regional levels, only about 21% of households in South Asia and 17% of households in sub-Saharan Africa have internet access at home. Mobile phone penetration rates are high, but when you drill down, it is not the case with mobile broadband or data services, or even smartphones, which have inbuilt accessibility features. Data from census and household surveys shows that households of persons with disabilities have lower ownership of almost all forms of ICT, personal computers or mobile phones, even landline phones. They have lower rates of internet use and also lower digital literacy and skills. And these gaps are higher for women with disabilities. So it is clear that many factors beyond the mere presence of technology need to be in place for digital inclusion. In our chapter, we offer 3 categories of drivers in the digital ecosystem that we should address to reap the benefits of accessible technology for persons with disabilities. First of all, the human dimension of accessible technology. We offer a couple of examples of technology failures because the human element was not addressed. One comes from a school in a country in Southern Africa, which has students with and without disabilities. A charity had donated huge numbers of lightweight individual braille typewriters, which would allow a student with visual disabilities to take their own notes in braille in real time in class. The alternative was waiting for weeks to get class notes. The problem was that only the devices were donated. Students and teachers were not trained on how to use them. So the writers really remained in storage as a result. Another example comes from wide consultations that we did with organizations of persons with disabilities in West Africa on digital identification systems, which rely on capturing biometrics. A child with Down syndrome was unable to register for his ID because the software to capture the photo of his face kept stalling an error. It had not been designed to recognize differences in facial features. And the enrollment officer, instead of checking the manual, which actually talked about exception protocols, sent the child away. So investing in the sensitization and capacity building of the human gatekeepers to digital services is essential. The second category is focusing on systems and institutions. The digital delivery of a service is not going to miraculously change things in terms of development if the underlying service itself continues to be inaccessible. So it's not just about digital systems, the analog systems need to be accessible too. So let's consider transport services. An accessible kiosk or a mobile ticketing service may allow someone to purchase a train ticket with ease, but the train itself may not be accessible. Or legal prohibitions to independent banking solely on the basis of having a disability negates the advantages of having accessible digital banking solutions. So really, digital investments need simultaneous actions towards improving the policy environment, the range and type of core services for persons with disabilities, and mechanisms to actually meaningfully interact and engage with public systems. Let me also add a note of caution on the over-reliance of using things like artificial intelligence or big data in new development programs without consciously addressing issues of bias or ethics. There are huge data gaps on the lived experiences of persons with disabilities in traditional data sets in developing countries, as well as the vast amounts of digital data used for big data analysis. So can we truly use analysis based on data that does not include the voices of persons with disabilities to drive development decisions that impact their lives? Or similarly for AI-enabled programs, we have to be mindful of replicating human bias or using data that comes from systems that have actually traditionally, intentionally excluded persons with disabilities, such as employment recruitment processes. The final category that we talk about is regulations and attention to the legislative environment that shapes the availability and use of technology, including the adoption of accessibility standards. And if we can borrow from experiences in developed economies, we know that the evolving nature of technology really requires just-in-time policies that are adaptive, that are modifiable, that are rapidly enforceable, and that are widely communicated both to consumers and producers of technology. So in conclusion, technology is truly a potent tool for inclusive development, but it is not a magic solution by itself. So to reap the optimal outcomes requires investments in what we call the analog components of the digital ecosystem as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepti. Over to you, Amy.
All right, thank you so much. That was so interesting. My name is, again, Amy Landers, and thank you to the Harvard Law School Library and the wonderful editors of the book, Michael and Jonathan. My topic has to do with the patent system, which is a creature of the North. It was a legal system developed in Europe and spread throughout the world through colonialism, and ultimately became frozen by the worldwide TRIPS agreement, of which so many countries have joined. So this treaty, this system, fundamentally is based on sets of assumptions, which essentially provide the inventor a right which restricts access of others to make that invention. So in other words, the patent goes to someone who is the exclusive source for being able to make and sell that invention. By restricting access, they get to charge supra-competitive pricing. In other words, very expensive pricing so that they can recoup the cost of their research and development. So these assumptions have environmental assumptions sort of built in as well. They assume, in the United States, we have comparatively easy access to funding, whether through grants, venture capital. There may be other mechanisms which people can access to fund sort of the creation and commercialization of their idea. Also, it assumes that we have customers who are able to pay for super competitive pricing. So it's a lot of assumptions that don't hold true in all cultures, in all areas. Primarily, the northern sort of companies hold the majority of patents in this space, in the assistive technology space. And they are complex and scientific breakthroughs and technological breakthroughs. And, there's some really wonderful devices which can cost thousands of dollars. They have many moving parts. For example, a refreshable Braille display may have numerous rows, up to 9 rows, which is, you can read quite a bit. But it makes it bulky, it makes it expensive, and it can be, as a practical matter, difficult to access throughout the world. According to one source, only 1 in 10 people in the developing world have access to the devices that they would like to have. And so these assumptions built in the North don't work terribly well for the rest of the world. What does work? What kind of innovations are coming out of the developing world? Generally speaking, they are based on different kinds of creativity. Very robust and very interesting problem solvers are working all around the world to create devices that are really giving people access in ways that are really meaningful to them. They are using variations of design thinking. For example, one is called market shaping, which considers that the user is the center of the invention. We really have to be empathetic and look at the world through their eyes and consider that their environment is diverse and complicated. And so one example of an invention which came out of this way of thinking is called the Orbit Reader, which is a very small, compact Braille reading device, which has only 1 line. It's very small. It's more in the $200 range and not in the $2,500 range. And so it's possible for organizations to buy a larger quantity of these and distribute them. And because they're fairly mechanically simple, they have fewer problems with breakage. And so, it can be used by all kinds of people in many kinds of conditions. Another kind of thinking is called systems thinking, where one sort of thinks about, okay, well, maybe there isn't this resource or that resource, but what is there? And so one invention is called the mBraille. The mBraille app, which essentially allows people to learn on Android phones, which are more accessible in some areas than others, but they are accessible. And so this app is used by children. The app was developed by deep conversations with teachers who said, I don't have time to look over everybody's shoulder. With the mBraille app, people can fundamentally teach themselves more independently. It gives feedback. It's a very consistent app, so you only have to learn how to use it once, and then it can take you to different levels where you can apply the same logic and extend your expertise pretty rapidly. The last kind I'm going to talk about is called frugal innovation, which essentially takes something that is very, very complicated and simplifies it. And one example is called the Braceset printer, which, there are Braille printers out of the global north that are very complicated and they're very quick, and they use a lot of different moving parts called solenoids. The Braille essentially reduced all of that complexity just to one solenoid, which is much less expensive. It's much less likely to break. It's much, less power hungry, and it works. And so the kind of thinking that is user-centric, really understands the environment, its strengths, and sort of how to fill gaps, are really coming up with some remarkable things. I will say that these kinds of inventions are not really clicking terrifically with a global patent system that was developed in the North. With the patent system that, for example, we have in the United States, we're really all about pushing science forward. We want to see you add. It's a very additive way of the kind of inventions that make it really add things to things that already existed before. They improve them. They may add super fast solenoids to printers. They may make things go the extra mile. And the patent system currently, for example, the one we're using in the US, does not reward reduction, simplification, user-centricness. And so I sort of posited in my chapter whether we could, under the global patent agreement, come up with a patent system that would reward things like free expression, human dignity, those kinds of concerns, in addition to scientific advance. And no one has done it, no country has done it so far. So what are our options? One would be to consider whether the patent system really works well for this particular field in each country. It is a system that's built for restricting access. And in this area, we would prefer, I think, to see broader access at lower prices. And so in my chapter, I explore alternative rewards that could be implemented either at a governmental or non-governmental entity level. For example, prizes, grants, direct funding, rewards for open source innovations, rewards for not patenting. For example, there's a lovely hearing aid that was developed by an individual who used solar power rather than battery, because batteries are hard to get. And it's a very soft mold, so you don't have to have it fitted. And he decided not to patent because he wanted everyone to copy so that there would be broader access to his invention. So lots to think about in sort of the ways that we in the North sort of reward certain kinds of thinking, and perhaps we even in the North could learn from some of the solutions that are being developed in the South. So thank you.
Thank you, Amy. That was wonderful. Raja, will you kindly join us?
So I thank you for the opportunity to talk about my chapter within the book Accessible Technology in the Developing World, talking about the Global South. And really focusing on including people who have disabilities in the design from the beginning. And making sure that people who have disabilities are involved in the process from the start and increasing their potential, protecting against loss, losing income. Those are the goals of the book, to really strive towards changing that. The challenge with banking in the global south is that there are not enough funds to support access for all to all services because it is so costly to do so. Each city and each rural area would have to fend for themselves. It requires years and years of sustained investment. So often with limited resource, there is the concern of the economy and the economic impact and the prioritization for over people who have disabilities and excluding them from the process, as well as the design and any new endeavors. So the book really looks at three core themes: the lack of attention given to innovations taking place in the developing world, the need to ensure that infrastructures in the global south do not present barriers to people with disabilities. And also the need to exercise caution when applying techniques from global north to the global south that they won't transfer effectively. More and more banks and financial services in the global south have focused on mobile banking and the access to those apps. But they negate other types of resources: roads, buildings, electricity, infrastructure that is required for the consumer to actually gain access to the internet itself, as well as the electricity to then power up the internet. And we want to make sure that there is a heavily influenced decision-making process based on people who have disabilities and their approach and their lived experiences. Not only in technology, but also in policy. To give you an example, if you think about a policy about finance and how that works with the banking system, knowing your client and knowing your customer. That you have to validate your identity with a personal banking card or some type of ID. Often these things become obstacles because of their cost to get those verification means provided. So possibly fixing those areas of weakness or gaps allows you to then provide access to a broader scope of people, including those with people who have disabilities. But not only through the bank, but also through the phone company itself. It can be a two-pronged attack. But again, there are still barriers that are present. In some developing countries, phones have become banks by offering financial services through the phone, where you're able to pay and then go to an area phone or area representative. Because a phone is more universal than banking. It's easier to have more central approach with the phone company than it would be to have an approach for each of the banks. One example comes from Kenya, where there's a much more centralized phone service that incorporates the banks. That average distance to a phone center is 1/10 of the distance that it takes you to get a bank. And that has a huge impact for people who live in rural areas or people who have disabilities as they try to arrange transportation to those areas. But the model can't be copied and it can't be transitioned to all places because there are barriers in different places that might not allow that to happen. Because there are banking solutions that do not go through financial services or do not go through banks, they go through other financial services. So then you need a financial manager who is able to break down those barriers, promote access, and be able to allow the consumer to have access to the phone service, but then to allow them to have access to those banking mobile solutions. So in summary, the Global South has many different obstacles that they are facing and barriers that they need to actually reduce. Those being the banking system as well as different financial services. It's important to encourage developing countries and specific centers by adding specific regulations, rules, and regulatory means to incorporate from a design perspective from the very beginning, the perspective of those of people who have people with disabilities. Then there also has to be training and awareness that has to be done. A lot of education in the area needs to be done. And then a reporting system needs to be put in place in order to make sure that all of those things that have been agreed upon are actually being followed through, and that the services are actually provided to people with disabilities that they've been asked. And we can also give us an opportunity to look through any gaps and analyze the process to see if we need to correct it and work through those problems. And again, this is from a bottom-up approach where you're gaining that access from the users of the service. So we want to make sure that access for all is the overriding theme, that we're able to have specific measuring tools in order to see that that success is undertaken and maintained so we can provide better access for all. So I thank you for the time.
Thank you ever so much, Raja. We have a wonderful question submitted by co-author, book contributor, Paul Harper from Australia that I think would be very appropriate for all three of our panelists. And you're welcome, of course, to take the question as you like and to use it in relation to your own perspectives. And Paul points out that a law student without a disability can walk into a law library, decide to either pick up the print book or click on the database, whereas a student with a print disability can either get help finding a print book or scanning it, editing it, and then reading it, or they could just use the digital format. So the digital access has significant effects for those students and staff with print disabilities. He points out that in the Global South, educational rates for certain disability groups are a fraction of that of their able-bodied peers. Kenya, for one example, is something like 1%. So if a person with a disability somehow manages to get through K to 12, they need access in higher education to become a professional, make their way in the world, and begin to express their leadership. How can we ensure this access in higher education? And he's asking for your thoughts, each of you, if you like. Maybe we could start with Raja and then work our way back to Amy and Deepti. And then Jonathan, you're in charge.
So having access digitally, a way to translate that information, having it available for anybody who wants to access it. I mean, it's a basic human right. And knowing how important education is, just having access to literary information should be a priority. You know, and having this education is going to be the foundation for all the other accessibility innovations that we come up with, whether it be in government, everyday life, banking. So it does need to start there.
I guess I would say that there's sort of two pieces from the IP perspective, and that would be ensuring that local law provides exceptions, which in many countries they do, to translate works that are published into accessible formats. And that is quite prevalent. And so to ensure that that translation can be done without concern. And then the other is to make sure that there are devices available to the extent that they're needed to access the material in the best way possible. And that really is sometimes a question of being able to afford the devices or having devices that are going to work in the environment that exist in those countries. And that can be, as you point out in your question, so important. And so with the patent side of things, right, maybe or a grant or maybe working with an agency to sort of develop something or get access to the devices, plus the translation side of things would be the primary concerns.
And so I can, I won't repeat, like agree fully with what Raja and Amy have said. And Paul, you raise a very, very important question. This is a serious gap. And it becomes one of the biggest challenges, right, in the pathway to work, including the digital economy. So, I mean, it almost seemed like you started answering your question yourself, just listing, just so many aspects of the system that actually need to be addressed. And I'm not, like I said, I won't repeat what my co-panelists have already said. But what I would recommend is thinking about a twin track approach, right? That we talk about a lot when it comes to disability inclusive development. So what we want to do is we want to ensure that students with disabilities have access to what students with disabilities without disabilities have access to, right? So the learning environment, learning materials, adapted examinations, the ability to learn not just in the school setting, but to be able to take your assistive devices or access your learning content in your home or your residential setting. So thinking just about these, so that's one track. But the second track is, have there been skills deficits or deficits in just the movement from primary to secondary to now higher education for students with disabilities that may need to be addressed? And the last thing I'll say, again, I think just underlining the human dimension that I spoke about and that we covered in our chapter, we really need to focus on training the different stakeholders, right, in the system. So not just about making sure that the students themselves are trained and able to use their assistive devices, able to use learning materials, but training school personnel, administrators, and teachers, not just on the importance of having accessible learning environments, but how do you incorporate technology into your curriculum, into your learning resources, into your supports. So again, just I think focusing on that capacity building is really important.
Great. Thank you again, Amy, Raja, and Deepti. We have time for one more question, and then Jocelyn is going to do a wrap up. So here's the one question. Now, the three of you are all actively involved in terms of digital accessibility in developing areas. What is either your takeaway, right, for people, or your action item for people who say, well, I work on accessibility, but I'm not involved in any developing areas. I work in North America, I work in Europe, I work for a tech company, I work at a university. What is your takeaway, your action item that you want to challenge those people to do, to learn about what actions to take to help improve overall technology inclusion around the world, especially in developing areas?
Maybe I can start.
Please, yes, Deepti, please first.
What I want to say is, if there's one thing that the last 18 months of the pandemic have proved to us, is that there is no such thing as borders, right? Viruses move and so do technologies. And your market is global. It is not just the country that you're headquartered in. It's a global market. And it's a global market, not just of consumers, but of content providers, of people who can expand your economic base. So, I mean, that would be my, big thing to say. And I think also the takeaway is, Jonathan, I just want to repeat what you said in the beginning, that, look, we have an opportunity, digital technologies, ICT are being used today across the world, in development. If we don't use this moment, we are actually going to cause more marginalization.
Great, thank you, Deepti. Fantastic answer. Who wants to go next? Amy, it looks like it's unmuted. So Amy, please, you go next.
I'm happy to. I guess I would say just recognize the extreme talent of so many people who are not maybe within your circle. Bring them in, hire them, get feedback from them, find out what their needs are. And, I think awareness of, there's so many excellent problem solvers, throughout the United States that I think if they could, listen, hear, and put themselves in the shoes of people who are living differently, I think that they could come up and support some incredible solutions.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Amy. And Raja.
Yeah, I would just want to add to that. The global economy, there's so much diversity that needs to be tapped into. For example, mobile banking, having that be developed in the global South, having that new app that isn't maybe so dependent on high internet services, or not only dependent on all these factors that aren't always stable. So just making sure that what's developed isn't only for the global North, that there's more diversity with our planning and more focus is on the global market, so it's beneficial to everybody.
Okay, a big thank you again to Deepti, Amy, and Raja, not only for being fantastic panelists today, but also for being just such a pleasure to work with throughout the whole book process. So thank you. A big thank you to Michael for co-editing the book with me. Thank you again to Harvard Law School for hosting this book talk, and a big thank you to the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study for hosting the initial exploratory seminar that kicked off this whole project. And now I will turn it back over to Jocelyn for wrap up.
Jonathan, you did a fabulous job wrapping us up. Thank you all. Thank you so much for being here today. You've given us all a great deal to think about. So we look forward to hearing more from all of you and reading the book. Thank you. Have a great afternoon, everyone.